Okay, so we just hit 11 o'clock Central Time. My name is Mike Vasquez. I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. Um, Welcome to those who are joining. And just for info, we'll be recording sections of this and posting it to our website later on so that if you need to drop off early or if you have a question and want to review something, this will all be posted probably later this week so that you can reference it. And if there are any follow-up questions or slides that didn't make sense, please let me know. And first, I want to just thank you for taking the time at the start of the week to talk with us about Trace. Really, the focus of today's conversation is how we've used the tool and developed the tool to help with qualifying AM processes and materials. It's a space we're very interested in. And I think some of the stuff and new work that we've done around this software tool are hopefully interesting and exciting to kind of what you may be doing. So with that in mind, I'm going to kind of walk through the focus of the webinar today. We'll aim to hit about probably 40 minutes of me talking to you. And then if there are questions, we can go through that at the end. There's a function on the Zoom meeting info or the Zoom meeting app that you can add in a question or a comment in the chat feature, so feel free to do that along the way. So why don't we get started here? So what I want to talk to you about is kind of three main things today. First, I'll give some context of kind of who we are, what we are doing, and kind of where the origination of Trace came from. I'll then get into some of the challenges that we were facing in the work that we've been doing in quality or qualifying materials and processes, and some of the groundwork that went into developing the software tool. And then I'm going to switch screens from the actual presentation itself over to a live demo. So I know those are always dicey to do, but I think I'll walk through how we actually use the software, and I think that gives a lot more perspective on kind of the overall context of this for qualifying materials and processes. So with that in mind, I'd like to, for those of you, I know some of the folks on the call I know, and some are we've just met in passing, but I'll give you a little bit of context of what 3 Degrees is and kind of where the original idea of Trace came from. So as I mentioned, my name is Mike Vasquez. I started 3 Degrees about 7 years ago now. We're based up in Chicago, but we have a number of folks that are on our team from a number of different geographies across the US. And really, we started 7 years ago with the idea and kind of with the hypothesis that as 3D printing starts to mature into a manufacturing technology, in some aspects, certainly it's still very niche in a lot, and probably will remain niche in many. We saw a kind of need to help organizations kind of walk that path through just thinking about using it for prototyping into kind of what are the steps that need to be taken to get into a production environment, first in terms of kind of business, the economics, the strategy of it all, but also kind of getting into the nitty gritty of maybe some would say the not sexy part of actually making it all work. So doing things like specifying vendors, identifying material feedstocks, identifying processes and machines, and getting into the place where you can reasonably kind of and quantitatively verify that you can produce parts repeatedly in an engineering robust manner that are also kind of useful from an economics and strategy perspective. So kind of my background, I'm a materials engineer, did a PhD focused on developing materials for AM, and so that's how I got started. But as kind of the company started out, we started working with a bunch of different organizations and really have kind of touched a lot of different industries. So at this point in time, we've probably worked with about 40 different companies in a number of different capacities. We kind of work a lot with end users who are kind of walking that path into production and moving along the adoption spectrum in AM, but also we kind of sit in the middle of the space, as well as working with kind of machine manufacturers who are developing new technologies, new processes, or kind of more efficient processes into the production realm for 3D printing and additive manufacturing, as well as kind of that kind of early core work with kind of chemical suppliers and kind of vendors on development of actual materials and feedstock for the processes. So kind of with that in mind, so for the last kind of 7 years, we've kind of played a number of roles in the ecosystem, and kind of all that focused really on the production aspect. And one of the things we kept seeing over and over again as you go through this kind of process and workflow is that kind of you can get a business plan, you can get a kind of established case together for why 3D printing, or whatever one of many reasons, might be a viable kind of technology. But as you get closer to making it a reality, there's a whole host of kind of variables, information, different islands of test reports and things that come into play when you want to go and scope through a fully validated process, either your machines or materials or a vendor, whoever it may be. And in doing that, kind of specifically, really this started about 18 months ago, with a kind of couple of projects and conversations that we were having. We just started to notice that as you go through this process, and many of you who are on the call may have done this before, in trying to map out all the different kind of steps of the AM workflow, AM process, regardless of the technology, whether it's metals or polymers or filaments. Each of those workflows generate a lot of information. Many of the decisions that you make across that workflow, whether it's design decisions or material information or process parameters, can have a pretty big impact on the overall kind of effectiveness of the parts at the end of the process. So it's really important to make sure that you track and document all of that. And we were seeing kind of in the industry, just observing what people were doing, and it seemed to be pretty inefficient. So about 18 months ago, we ended up doing a listening tour and did a survey of about 50 companies, and just started asking questions like, hey, how do you document some of your, like, what are you doing, really was the first question we asked, for kind of qualifying your processes. Or if you think about a part that you're going to take more down the pathway of production, whether it's a few hundred or a few dozen, kind of how are you documenting, ensuring quality management and quality control. And funny thing was, the most common thing that came back was like, Paul over in engineering has an Excel spreadsheet that has a lot of this information, or most of this information, or until we need to present it, we're trying to build our own system in-house. So there was a lot of challenges there, and kind of what we ended up seeing was three big problems. One is there's a lot of variables, but no consistent framework, especially if you're going through this process of qualifying a part in a specific material and specific process. And I'll get more into the details of that later. Secondly, there's kind of no centralized data source. Oftentimes, we saw kind of people, like, there may be a central Excel spreadsheet that has most of the information, or like a SharePoint kind of data file, or some bigger organizations do have existing kind of quality management systems, but not really tuned to AM, and especially the different workflow steps. So customizing that was somewhat of a challenge. And especially kind of as you get more into the weeds of additive, there are some pretty good standards getting written and have already been published along several different types of technologies, and none of the kind of pieces on the market that we saw had really integrated some of those best practices and approaches yet. And then the third piece was, we saw this over and over again with companies that we talked to, is that knowledge transfer is quite challenging, as many of you kind of may have gone through or experienced is because additive is still fairly small and growing and kind of emerging, there are these kind of folks in these different companies that have a lot of information about how the process works, how the parts are going, the material management, the vendors, all the standards, all the kind of specs and things. And if they were hit by a train or if they left one day, a lot of that information kind of sets back, the loss of that information may set back folks kind of a period of time. And even kind of if that's not the case, as you start to scale up and look for more and more applications, it's not really scalable just to have kind of these really kind of superstars that are just kind of know everything about the technology in and out and know every piece of what's going on at every kind of point in time. You really need to have a kind of a scalable solution that there's at least some visibility into the process. So, and with all that in mind, we decided to kind of go down the pathway of developing a tool that hopefully does three things in addressing those problems that we identified. And one is kind of helping just to save time and money. So, I mean, the AM process, depending on the technology, really works in a lot of the same ways. The workflow is consistent. You've got design, you got materials, feedstock, process parameters, and sort of quality kind of reports and post-processing. And generally the framework's kind of consistent, but it's unique to AM. So we wanted to create something that would follow that framework and be able to build upon how you might qualify a process or material. Kind of getting into that compliance piece is documentation is critical. So having a place where you can know that your kind of latest parts that were built with 17.4 stainless from Carpenter with batch number 1234 deliver these tensile properties at this process machine parameter set. And you know that going back 3 months, 4 months, a year from now, and not have to dig it up over time, and also can look into how is that changing if you change a batch or a particular parameter set in your machine. So that's pretty important information, and hopefully kind of getting away from some of the standard approaches to doing that. And then as you build upon that, kind of getting into your final parts, you really have that story that's developed over time. So, you know, kind of for a given part, kind of who was the designer, what was the material that was used, what was the process parameters, and over time you start to really build that story. And as it's collected here in the tool, you can look that up. And if you're a vendor or if you're building parts for a certain product line, if you have to repeat that 6 months to a year from now, you can go back and do that, and you have the full story there. So, so one of the interesting things that, as we get into this a little bit more detail, that we found in talking to people is kind of on average, it took, if you had kind of a representative 10 builds per month kind of schedule at your facility, we were trying to gauge like how long are people taking to compile this information and data and analyzing it and kind of reporting out on it. And it was often kind of at least somewhere around 2 to 3 hours per build to get this information kind of across the spectrum, and kind of doing a quick calculation into kind of how does that translate into engineers' time over a year. You're starting to get into kind of thousands of dollars of time that people are taking to kind of compile this. And this is at a fairly small scale with where additive is in terms of production for most companies. So it's important kind of from a financial perspective as well to kind of hopefully kind of shift some of the resources from kind of documentation and reporting out to maybe thinking about new topology optimization designs or speccing a new material. So so kind of getting into kind of what does the tool do and kind of where we're going with this. So it's a software tool kind of based on the cloud, or it actually can be deployed locally from a security perspective, that helps kind of walk through that AM workflow in a kind of approach that maps to specific standards as well as specific processes. So the aim is really to help kind of ensure repeatability and quality management throughout the process. And kind of as we get into how do we think about this in terms of managing and kind of going through the qualification of materials and process, what we tried to do, and we actually kind of as part of our listening tour and just our experience with kind of being engaged with the organizations like America Makes and ASTM and others, we started to kind of build in specific frameworks that existing standards have started to develop. So these are a handful of the standards that we've tried to integrate into the tool as it stands now. So with the focus on some of the technologies and industry spaces that are more heavily regulated, so the aerospace, automotive kind of aspects. So you would thinking through like some of the existing standards that are written for aerospace, for instance. So there's the FAA guidance, and for parts, some of the NADCAP and ASW standards as well are started to integrate into Trace and help provide some of that framework, so that as you don't kind of get up to speed on going through this process, this can be a tool that helps take some of the pain out of doing that, which often happens sometimes. So okay, getting into specific examples. So like, how do we use this before I get into the actual full demo? Because I think that's important to really show as well as, actually, I think I might do the demo now, because I think these case studies would be a better addition if we do that. So I'm gonna change it up on us, and then I'll go back to the demo, because I think that's important, or the case studies as well. So so if I've switched over now to kind of what the tool actually looks like on the web. So this is the version on the cloud, easiest to deploy and show for this demo. But we built it in such a way that it's easily deployable for from a security standpoint behind a firewall. Often many of the folks that we talked to in terms of getting this deployed and implemented are interested in that from a security perspective, and folks on our development team have worked with a number of government organizations, including the Air Force, to build secure systems. So that's some of this data can be kind of highly valuable. So we're extremely conscious of that as we go through this and how we built it. So just to alleviate that, that's often a question we get as we start in here. So beginning into Trace, so kind of this is the essentially the tool and the dashboard that you would see, and why we think this could be a useful thing as you go and start to develop your processes for qualifying materials and machines. So if you look at the dashboard right now, so hopefully people can see my cursor and during the demo. So we've got the dashboard here. So as you would log in, you'd be able to have your own unique ID. We can build in teams, which I'll show in a second. But this is essentially the page that would be demonstrated and displayed when you first log in. And so what we see here are a couple of things which I'll highlight now and let it go into detail as the workflow develops. So first one is kind of completed projects, kind of what has gone through the entire AM workflow. The other piece is the active projects. So when we think about active projects, you also have a kind of a status of those across the kind of bar here. Is a completed project is something that, as we define it, goes from kind of, you've got the initial design inputs and specifications, but then it goes further on to the kind of process of selecting the materials, actually building the part, post-processing, inspection, and that can take, depending on the organization and the level of post-processing, it could take a week of time, it could take a couple of weeks, it could take up to a month, depending on the actual kind of approach. So that's why it's nice to have some visibility into, hey, we've got 3 projects or 3 parts that are in line on more on the design side, or ones that are getting spec for the materials, or more inline and being built, but at least you have some visibility here as that starts to pile up. You have some images of kind of recent builds that you may have, and I'll show kind of the case study, as I mentioned, when I go back to the slides after this. But also on the side here, we start to see some of the analytics as we kind of build up that repository of information, especially as you get into kind of ensuring quality across the timeline of builds and machines. So we're tracking things like average tensile strength or modulus, kind of material used. We're also kind of doing kind of more robust analyses, say for instance, tracking energy density input via density of the actual part, as well as kind of tracing that back to kind of tensile strength or whatever it would be. So kind of automatically taking that kind of ratio of kind of laser power over scan spacing for some of the kind of powder-based processes and implementing that here, so you can have a over time kind of view of that process. So as we get into this, one thing I'll highlight first is the team function. So as we get into kind of more manufacturing kind of level production areas, there's often the need to have a number of folks engaged in a one project. So what we have here is you can build in teams, and then within those teams you can have certain users that you can designate to say, hey, Ben only needs to have access to the post-processing because that's what he's focused on, or Sally only has to look at some of the material stuff and getting some of the info in there. So I'll show more how that works in a second, but that is a function in here. So as we get into kind of more of the actual process of what does it mean to create a record, and how does this make sense for kind of qualifying a part or process, what we kind of really view Trace as is a process to capture that entire story of the AM workflow, but in a manner that's robust and based on engineering principles that through kind of the academic literature, both in AM as well as the standards literature, and kind of the best practices for making sure that the process is robust. So what I did just now was look at kind of creating a new project. And what that opens up is essentially kind of this process record. We think of this as kind of your internal Dewey Decimal System, if anyone's old enough to actually know what that is. But essentially, like, how do you track and how do you mark your parts and builds? And here you'd be able to describe kind of your projects, what it is, actual record number or serial numbers you might have. You could set access to specific teams. You might want to just add, hey, this is just going to be a 3 degrees project. You can add that and designate those folks to have access to it. And then here is kind of where it starts to get interesting from a kind of the quality and quantification piece of it. So we have a number of templates that we've designed. This one only has a handful, but I'll leave it at default because I think we'll go through the metal powder bed fusion approach, but we've also kind of designated some for polymer powder bed and FDM. But essentially what the template does, and we kind of define templates on 2 different approaches. One is what standard you might want to be kind of looking at for your specific workflow. If it's an FAA specific, FDA, or kind of ASTM specific approach, or if it's a specific type of technology that you're using, kind of laser powder bed metal versus electron beam versus FDM. So both of those kind of designate a template. So we'll leave it at default because I'll show that's more of a kind of a standard kind of metals approach. So click save here, and then what happens is you start to see kind of here's the workflow that many of you are probably familiar with in the process. So you get into things like, if I were to fill that in, I would have had text, of course, but kind of the next piece is, okay, let's kind of start to build that story of the part. And as you get into kind of qualifying your materials process, we're starting to get into that information that you want to make sure you're documenting each step of the process. So for this, let's just kind of pick a FDA guidance, for instance. But what that would do then is outline, okay, for the remaining of kind of steps of the process, here are the critical elements that you want to document to map back to that standard and kind of crosswalk back to the requirements in that piece of that template or that standard. So we get into kind of file and design aspects here. So what files are you using, the format of the files, are there orientations that are set? You could add a build image if you want to kind of validate that, hey, this part was built in this direction, elements of the support structures, things like that. Also, you may want to designate, hey, we're adding ASTM tensile bars to this process. So then we start kind of building up that story, and here's where kind of the information as you start to go down the pathway of qualifying your materials kind of comes into play. So you may want to kind of set what material you're using. These are all kind of elements that would be critical for making sure that you have repeatability and essentially kind of a robust design of experiments, essentially, that you can kind of go map and review. So things like your vendor of the material, your specific batch number. Had you done a qualification build set before on these types of materials? You may want to have your particle size distribution outlined here, your chemistry of the part, or the particles that you're using. We'll default to metals just for the remainder of this example, but just so you don't lose me there. You may have flow tests or other test reports that you can start to attach to the specific build. So you don't have to go back for each build and look up like, hey, what was that? What was the material that we used in that specific one? Similarly, as you get into the next level of variables that impact your parts and your processes is the actual kind of printing process itself. So what machine are you using? The model number, when was it configured, which is often something that's critical, important to make sure you're mapping. And then kind of get into more of the details of the actual machine. So what's your recorder blade situation look like? Did you do measurements to ensure, or did you have to do measurements to ensure that your kind of build plate was flat, or kind of which build plate serial number did you actually use? Purge gas information, kind of temperature limits, your parameter files, layer thickness, kind of build date, who was a technician as well. So again, kind of starting to put together things you're probably already documenting or have somewhere, either it may be on the machine itself, but at least it's now kind of tied to some of the other variables that are impacting your parts, and say if something does go wrong, you have a way to kind of map that back. Kind of as we get then through the process, you have a number of kind of elements that happen after the fact. This is often the more interesting part in some ways, because a part that comes out of the machine often looks very different, both chemistry wise or material science wise, as well as appearance wise, to that final part that may hit the customer floor. So kind of you get into the post process. So how much material was used, and then what are you doing in terms of your checklist here? So how are you removing the material? Are you doing a heat treatment? Kind of what's your stress relief schedule look like? You can attach what those kind of ramp up charts might be here. And two things I want to highlight as well is kind of one, it's very easy for us to change the template. So I'll show briefly how that does, but all this could be customized. So if you don't want to if you don't do some of this, if you're not doing hipping or something on your parts, then that's not relevant. You could take it out. And the second piece is we're trying to make this as kind of user-friendly as possible, so that the data entry position isn't a factor in quality. So we're talking to some machine vendors to get kind of direct APIs in, so that some of this can be automatically populated, but some will still have to be generated today, given there's a lot of options of material, options of machines, and test equipment out there. So again, you'd be able to timestamp this to say who did it and where and when. And then as you get into the actual parts, kind of maybe as built parts, you might be doing some kind of density testing, CMM, or CT scannings on. You'd have an ability to kind of map that here, as well as document test reports. Similarly, with any kind of fully post-processed, you could do that here. And then you start to enter kind of, this only allows for one entry point, but you may have your average tensile strength for the coupons that you put in, or a series of coupons as well. That is what starts to map back to some of those analytics I pointed out in the beginning. So you can do things like comparing your tensile strength of your aluminum silicon mag over the last 10 builds or whatever it may be. And then again, who did it, when was it done? And then finally, what you'd want to do is kind of have a sign off and just say, hey, everybody has looked at this, or one key person has reviewed and says it's complete. We can save that. And then what we can do, and what you see, is it goes into kind of this completed repository, where now there's only 3 in this one, but as you imagine, you'd start doing this for 1, 2, 3 months. You have kind of dozens of builds that you could sort by machine or feedstock or particular batch, and start to compare those, or export it as a full list to show your boss to say, hey, here's the utilization of the machine over the last quarter. But the nice thing is, if you start to click on these, you actually get that full story. So it's a really nice way to kind of collect that information here. So you get kind of the process record, and you can pull down what material was used on this part, and kind of what was the build date. You could export that as a full report. So kind of going back to that idea of like, how do we reduce kind of time in this whole process? So you can have kind of full one-click reporting out, and that could be kind of a template, more of an executive report as well. That makes most sense for your company. And the other thing that we've started to do, and for those of you who are going to be at Rapid, we were at AMUG, and we talked to some of you on the call, I think, at AMUG as well. But we actually tied this information specifically to parts. So if you have a serial number or a QR code or something, and the Trace app application open, you can actually scan that part serial number and pull up that report directly. So if you have a series of tensile coupons or brackets or parts or whatever this may be, you could use your phone or an iPad to scan that part and kind of come up with this report, so that in perpetuity you have kind of the information of how it was built, and all the really detailed information of how it was manufactured. So kind of that's the workflow, and I wanted to do that kind of before I go back to some of the case studies that we have now, and just give you a sense of that. The last piece I'll talk about here, as we're getting on to kind of a little bit over halfway through the hour, is kind of, as you think about the AM kind of operation, you certainly have the inline data that is relevant for every build that you're doing, what material, what kind of machine you're using. But what we noticed, and having set up a number of facilities over the last couple of years, there's a whole host of information that kind of lives around the ecosystem that's important to capture, either from a kind of a safety perspective or ISO 9001 perspective, to ensure kind of quality and management documentation. So what we've included on this side here is kind of a repository for what are those kind of a place where those critical information can live. So you have maybe your reference standards that you have, so everyone can review either on the process side or kind of how you're doing the actual builds, or more the safety side. So maybe if it's metal, you have your NFPA standards, or other kind of building code standards that you'd want to have positioned there from a change management perspective. Similarly, you'd be able to kind of have a place for your MSDS sheets, or kind of qualification documents for your certificates of conformance for your materials. Also your operating procedures to ensure that both your machines are operated correctly and repeatedly, but also things like emergency procedures, things like that could live here. And then kind of, this is one thing we kept getting a lot of feedback on, was kind of maintenance and making sure that you know, when was the last time a machine was maintained and have that record live somewhere. Should be able to have that information here, along with kind of a bank of information about your ancillary equipment. So that often encompasses a bigger footprint in some cases than your actual machines. So you want kind of maintenance records on your wet separators or your sieving stations or whatever it may be. So you kind of have that in one place as well. Other people have added things like training, so that know who's been trained on what machines, and can keep that up to date as well. So kind of that's the web tool or the actual software itself. I'm going to flip back to the presentation here just to kind of run through some case studies specific to how we might use that for qualifying materials and processes. But I think you're hopefully starting to get the idea that kind of what you're able to do here is really kind of, with the AM workflow in mind, map what are those critical elements of documenting kind of part builds and material information and process information, as well as post-processing inspection, all in one place, so that as you start to build that kind of data set of quality builds or performance builds, you start to have a one-stop shop to really look at that. So I'm going to go back to this here. And just for some context, of the tool, so we're fairly new. While 3 Degrees has been around for about 7 years, we just kind of officially launched the tool in kind of somewhat of a stealth mode in kind of late last year, kind of Q4 of 2018, with a number of test centers, and then launched officially at AMUG a couple weeks ago, and then we'll be at Rapid at the end of the month, or end of May. And here's one kind of example case study that we did with Renishaw. We were talking to them about how do we kind of use Trace to go through some of the quality builds that they may do on machines and processes. So looking at kind of how would you kind of go ahead and document tensile builds, fairly straightforward build, but something that probably many of you have done over and over again. So just as a way to kind of more easily map this to kind of broader properties in the entire kind of value chain. So we were doing some work in kind of demonstrating Trace to kind of map that specific tensile build or series of tensile build based on the specific materials and maybe changing parameters in the machine, so you could track that over time and see changes with the resulting manufacturing and mechanical properties of the parts. So another one that we're looking at too, as we get more into this is the polymer side, so it may not be as relevant for some folks, but there's some good ASTM standards out there of, as you kind of, one of the important things as you think about going towards kind of qualifying specific parts, there's some really good literature out there of like how to actually kind of classify what type of component it is that you're building. Is it a mission critical? Is it something that is going to require a lot of validation, or is it something kind of less critical? So we've started to integrate into Trace kind of classifying that type of part. So if it's a kind of very mission critical part, kind of defined as class 1, this is kind of polymer powder bed again, so mapping to ASTM 3901. So you'd have kind of a template for a series of parts along with the representative areas where the tensile coupons might go as well. And then as you get down to like a class 2, you notice you have kind of just a handful of tensile coupons that are spanning the X direction of the build. So a few kind of less parts that map the part, because you may not need as much documentation on that. And then kind of the class 3 is kind of that less rigorous, where you're not really capturing any of the data on the tensile parts as well. But starting to kind of essentially tier kind of what level of part is this, and then how does that map to specific information that you'd want to incorporate in the build, and subsequently the files themselves. So, so I've already done the demo here, and I'm not going to go kind of through that. Kind of the one kind of piece that I did want to show in more detail is that reporting feature. So as I mentioned, kind of the idea of the report is kind of both on the executive level was kind of having a one pager that you'd be able to see kind of the critical elements that you may have entered into the part and that part story. And that can be templated to have your specific kind of company logo or whatever reporting requirements you may need, as well as that full report, which would have every kind of piece of information and the build schedule of everything that was done on that component. So, so as I mentioned, from a security standpoint, I'm going to kind of start to wrap up here and leave some time for questions. So if you have any questions that you want to share now or feel free to ask them offline as well. But there should be a chat feature that I can read those as we go along. So I'll probably got about 5 minutes of talking left, and then we'll go into questions as well. From a security standpoint, as I mentioned, we're following best practices in terms of the cloud-based security control. We have role-based access control for the database itself. All the deployments are isolated on the cloud. Certainly if they're locally deployed, that'd be isolated. And then kind of depending on security means something different to every organization. So depending on the exact requirements, we do accommodate those where appropriate. This is the tech stack for any of those that are interested. I'm not going to dwell on that. But just to kind of wrap up on this for the day, and kind of some context here. So ultimately, kind of as we've started to show this information to people and getting some feedback, we kind of come across kind of three big things that people have given us feedback of, like, hey, why is this important, or why should we kind of continue to go down this path? And one is we've heard that quality management inevitably comes up at some point in the conversation, especially as folks are starting to invest $5, $10, $50 million into AM facilities. That's awesome. That's great. I think it's exciting to see, but there are a lot of nuances to using the technology, whether it's metal or polymer or whatever it may be, that a lot of people are trying to figure out, whether that's auditing agencies or standard organizations or safety organizations, internal or external. So that conversation inevitably comes up, and what we're aiming to do is help make that conversation a bit easier and more transparent, to say, hey, here's what we're doing, here's kind of what we're mapping to now. Everything may not be figured out in terms of the existing standards literature, but we have it as an internal system, and here's how it's being documented. The next piece is that, kind of, as people have investigated this more, it's extremely costly and time consuming to build something like this from scratch. So even if Trace or other piece of software doesn't do everything, it kind of helps kind of move the needle along in doing specific actions, whether that's kind of qualifying a process or a material, or tracking kind of production builds. And then kind of the standards landscape is continuing to evolve. As I mentioned, we sit on a number of the committees looking into standards and are constantly reviewing those. I know it sounds extremely exciting, but important nonetheless. And we keep pace on those and as those evolve, we're trying to kind of keep up with that as it gets integrated, and make sure that we've kind of transfer that knowledge effectively into the tool. So as we wrap up here, just to tell you a little bit about where we're at. We've installed Trace at a number of kind of pilot facilities over the last kind of late last year, really looking at kind of kicking the tires a little bit and kind of getting feedback before we launch live at AMUG. We'll also be at Rapid up in Detroit as well, and we're commercially kind of available at this point. For those of you who are interested, we can do custom demos or talk through specific applications and templates depending on the specific use case. So I know today I kind of talked a little bit more about the metals and aerospace and FDA side, but certainly we've looked and demonstrated other templates and things using like Altem on FDM and others. So a lot of the templates kind of remain the same because, as I mentioned, the workflow of AM at a high level is somewhat constant. You have these big buckets of steps that you do, but there is nuance in kind of every process, even every machine to some extent, that we've done our best kind of as a small company to integrate as well. And we're continuing to grow out, build features into this, and especially over the next few weeks, some of those more kind of detailed analytic tools where you can start to map kind of more detailed build parameters to material feedstock or tensile parameters will continue to be more animated and also kind of easier to view and segment over time. So my contact information is below. I'll send a follow-up email to those who are kind of on the call as well. Or if you weren't on the call or register there, just feel free to email me. So it's mike@3degreescompany.com. Our website is www.traceam.com. So you can check out kind of more information, and we'll be posting the webinar link there once this is done, so that if you have more questions or I went too fast or I mumbled through something, you can go back and check that out. But yeah, feel free to reach out. We're looking for feedback. We're kind of trying to learn as much as we can about this. I'm going to go back to the demo page as well if need be. So if anyone has any questions, I'll start to answer those. So we got one here. So kind of first question that I saw is there a storage limit or number of record limits? So if we go back to, whoops, here, what I'll show is, so kind of, yes, in some cases. So the way we've kind of tiered the use case is really kind of dictated in terms of storage by the number of users and the types of templates that you're using. So you may have a DMLS system built for your EOS M290, and then your 3D systems, polymer laser sintering machine. We'd have kind of two different templates. That's how we've scaled it so far to kind of map to. So an individual record doesn't cost you anymore. It's more based on kind of the types of templates that you're doing and kind of overall number of users. Certainly, like if it's that's on the cloud-based. So if it's something that's deployed locally on your own servers, there's no limit to that. So hopefully that came out clear. I stumbled a little bit in the beginning, but hopefully you got the idea. But really kind of the bottom line is we're looking at kind of, at least as we start and deploy this to those who are interested, what we're doing, just kind of to be 100% transparent, is kind of looking at kind of working very closely with those who we're deploying this solution to. So software is great. We use software every day in our lives, but some of it works better than others. And I think what we're aiming to do, at least certainly as we get off the ground, is be very hands-on with those who we're working with. And that's what we've been doing so far, is to actually walk through their kind of quality process with them, or their kind of overall production process. Let's do an audit from our perspective. I mean, as I mentioned, we do kind of work with a number of industries and organizations and applications on the standard side. So kind of bring some of our knowledge from that space into kind of a quality audit, and then go through kind of how your template might have to look. And that's what we customize to start out for those who are working with us at the beginning as well. So thank you for that question. Any other questions for anyone? If not, I want to mention one more time, we'll be up at Rapid. I forget our booth number, but certainly look us up. We'd love to talk to you in more detail on that, show you some of the newer features that we'll have there. If you're not at Rapid and want to talk more, or if this is interesting to ask some more detailed questions, please let me know. Once again, my email is mike@3degreescompany.com. I'll send a follow-up email to those of you who are on the webinar right now with the link to this recorded information. And then, yeah, thanks again for spending some time on this Monday to talk through this with us. And if you have any other questions or comments or feedback, or say, hey, Mike, I should definitely think about doing this, please let us know. As I mentioned, we're kind of getting started with this. We like to talk to industry. We're involved in a lot of the industry groups, and we welcome the feedback and want to make sure that we're building something that's relevant to folks in the space, especially as they go down that production pathway. So thank you for your time, and I'll give you 9 minutes back of your day. So take care. Thank you.